to another episode of Debt Nation, where we are busy putting death out of business. And great episode coming up for you here. We're going to talk China and COVID-19. Very interesting episode coming up. So before we do get into that, let's thank our sponsors. Let's thank Thrivous. That's you can get free geoprotectors and nootropics from $5 all the way up to $160. You know the deal. The link is in the description. Share the link around, say thanks Thrivous, and get yourself some free Thrivous. Also want to thank David Kelly, I Am Transhuman campaign. Lots and lots of new posts coming up on that campaign all the time. Go and check that out. All right, Kevin Flynn, it's really good to have you back on the show. It's good to see you. How you been?
Good to have you back on the show.
I've been great. Things are going well for us. We're super busy as a result of the virus. People are really serious about whether or not their remote work is genuinely secure and encrypted, and the fact that there's a rise in cyber attacks around that by some terrorists who are attacking civilians and their private property as opposed to between combatants and governments. So to defend against those state terrorists engaged in attacking civilians or breaking into Equifax, which happened last year. Now those terrorists are on the FBI list. And so, we just want to defend people and private property and the free market and how it functions free of terrorist state interference.
Fantastic. And, we post COVID-19, we really are entering a new age, a digital age. The digital innovations are rising. All these remote services, Uber, everything like that. So, the digital age is rising up, and, you're on the right side of that. So that's a good transition to be a part of. I think the real world has some legs left in it, but we'll have to see how much post COVID-19. But I think you are on the right side of that, and security is right at the center of that. It might not be the most sexy subject, but it definitely is something super important. So all the best to you. All right, so we're going to talk about China here today. China is a very interesting country. It was the beginning. It was the epicenter. Wuhan was the epicenter of the COVID-19 debacle that has left the world on edge. I mean, we've come full circle now, and it's just laid out economic destruction. There's been essentially a kind of almost a genocide of certain demographics of people. Thousands of people have lost their lives. It's infected and destroyed many people. Many businesses have toppled. Economies are on the verge of collapse. This has not been very fun for people, and it began in China. And now China is running little conspiracy theories about this and that about the United States, dropping in the virus and all this sort of stuff. A lot of nonsense coming out of Beijing. Where do you want to start with this China talk, Kevin? I know you've been following it very closely, and well done, and thank you for that. But where do you want to start on the story of COVID-19 and its relationship with China?
Okay, it's kind of a big one. So, in the very beginning, they hid a lot of information. And one of the top researchers from the Wuhan lab was Huan Yanli, who is missing. And the government assured the people in the Chinese internet that she's alive. But generally, the government there doesn't like rumors. So what they would do is the state powers just make her appear to make the rumor go away. But they can't seem to make Huan Yanli appear. And there's a lot of evidence that she might be patient zero, and that they were in a southern province and they had put a job application up on the website in November looking for researchers for specifically for transmission of the coronavirus to people, that they made a discovery. And then in December, there was like another job posting, something about very specifics like that as well in December. So the Chinese government knew for a while, and they knew that this was very bad. And that researcher who was in charge of it is gone. and their stuff is removed and scrubbed from the website from Wuhan lab like they never worked there. So generally, governments who don't like rumors and conspiracies don't scrub websites and make it disappear. All the employees who left that lab, their bios are still there, interns and everyone. There's only one person who ever worked at Wuhan lab whose stuff is scrubbed, and that is that woman, Huan Yangli, whose job is in particular to be an expert on bat transmissibility and coronavirus. So it looks like the Chinese government behaved very weird from the very beginning because they were worried about the image that it would reflect on their professionalism that patient zero was from the lab. I've always found that the truth is sometimes much better than digging ourselves in deeper holes. But the Chinese government believes that it can control its image, and it thinks that its rise to power is dependent upon a positive image. So the government there doesn't have many new ideas of their own, and they read American literature by Joseph Nye and soft power, and America's image as exceptionalism. And they want to copy that as well. They just don't have any good ideas of their own. And so they think that their positive image is essential to their growth. There's a difference between one wanting to be altruistic and have a positive image and then doing that because you think it's necessary to wield power. It's very clear that even if you bring this negative stuff up or you catch someone in a lie from the Chinese government, they're not interested in admitting that because it gets in the way of what they want. And what they want are pride, emotional stuff, to be the heroes in the movies and these kind of identity-seeking, low-signal, high-noise values, low-signal, high-noise values. And the thing about it is that you can't image your way to respect, not on a global stage in a free world. And I think their leaders are learning that. You can try to silence the NBA and stuff like that, but when the rubber meets the road, all that image gets ripped out from under them. The other thing is that from a great power perspective, they're the new person on the block. When we go to get a new job or anything, the new person has to do 2 and 3 times more than everyone else to prove their trust. So the incumbents always have easier. I see a lot from their leaders and their nationalistic people saying that, the U.S. does this and that, and it's not fair. Of course it's not fair. You're new in the global stage, and you've got to do more than everyone else to prove yourself, and that is fair because that's how human beings are, right? When something is new, we scrutinize it much more than everything else. And that's totally fair, rational behavior. But if you say that, then they will pivot to something else and pivot to something else. And you finally figure out they don't care. It's just about power, right? It doesn't matter what excuse they come up with. If soft power won't work, they'll switch to something else. And then if that doesn't work, they switch to something else. And they're going to keep going, and they're not going to stop. They're definitely not content being exactly where they are, even if they grow a lot of wealth. They want the whole pie. At least if you, whenever in debate, people keep pivoting to different excuses to get what they want, you kind of figure out what's really going on here, right? I mean, if you disprove something, if you prove that climate change is real, and you completely do it, and you have a response, the other party should surrender, give up and say, you are right and I am wrong, I will change all my values. But you'll never get that from the CCP on anything. They will never admit being wrong about something and change, not in public. And it's because also it's just their own, it's like a high noise, low signal system.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you mentioned a lot in there, and there's a lot of good points in there as well. And it's you mentioned power being something that's right at the center of how the CCP operates, and power and propaganda obviously coming from a communist base, and that's what they are. They still are communists. They're proud communists, whether or not they're wrapped in cotton candy capitalism or whatever they want to call it, state-officiated capitalism. Its power is at the center, and this means that They don't have any regard for their own officials. You know, the Xi Jinping had done the purge of his own party, his own political leaders in 2015, especially notable. Thousands sent to jail or missing, and anybody who stands up to them, whether the billionaires who are overseas in the United States or in Canada or hiding out wherever, these people go missing. They are harassed. They're legally chased around the block if they speak out against China, and their own citizens, you know, are subject to all sorts of horrendous structures and pains. I mean, they were welding people inside their homes, welding people indoors. I mean, you know, there was horrific reports of people still being alive and possibly being cremated alive because the health officials in certain districts were so worried that Beijing would come down and clamp down on them, that they were doing whatever to please Beijing. But power is definitely something that's at the center. And you know, I've always said that the CCP, because I'm not a China bull. I'm a China bear. I think that China will eventually collapse, and something different will, especially the CCP, will eventually collapse, and something different will replace it. But in the meantime, I believe that they've read their own propaganda and that they believe their own propaganda about Chinese exceptionalism, that they believe it wholeheartedly, and they push above their weight and their capacity as the new kid on the block, as you say, as someone who you know, they actually think that they can become the CEO. Maybe that's right. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm completely wrong in my analysis, and maybe they are going to become the new kid on the block. I have Dave Lee on all the time, who's a China bull, and we argue constantly about this. He thinks that China's rise is something almost inevitable. He sees it as something quite unstoppable. I disagree with him, and we go on and on about it. But power is definitely at the center. It's not money. It's not respect for life or values or the people or citizens or international law or law of the sea, which is China is the big one who goes against the law of the sea. There's a lot we can go on about human rights, but definitely China it's about power, it's about authority, it's about control, and they're using COVID-19, which has been a human tragedy, to leverage power internally and leverage power externally. And you know, it's really about what you said at the start, that cover-up, that initial cover-up, whatever happened there with the wet markets or the lab or whatever, that initial cover-up is a human tragedy, and it's a tragedy for the whole globe.
100% agree with you. So, you know, they can get engaged in the whataboutisms. So the U.S. or Italy responded like this, but you know, that's not how ethics work. So, you know, a drunken driving is a crime, but drunken driver who doesn't hit anyone is not committing involuntary manslaughter, right? A drunken driver that hits someone and kills them is going to go to jail probably for involuntary manslaughter, right? So it's about what you do, not about what could have happened theoretically. And at the end of the day, they're the ones who initiated it, and they covered it up for 2 months. So they are responsible. The hypotheticals have no meaning whatsoever. You don't use it as a defense in court. It could have happened to anyone else, but it didn't. It happened to you, so you're responsible. And there's nothing else to discuss. Sit down, quiet. And that's it. So they're responsible for it. It doesn't matter what else happened in history or who did what, or US and Iraq, doesn't matter. You're responsible for this right here now and not another person. Too bad. And that's the condition.
And you're right. And, you know, it's not about, again, and we always have to say this, it's not about the people. It is about the CCP. It's about their political structure and the political ruling class that's inside of China. It's definitely the big problem. I mean, look at Taiwan. Taiwan is basically the same subset of people. They are literally the Chinese people, and they're democratic. And, you know, they're exporting help all over the world. Those guys have sorted coronavirus out. They shared information. They knocked it out of the park, and now they're helping other people. I think they just signed a bill for $13 billion or something to help other nations around the world deal with coronavirus. So it's definitely not the people. The people are, you know, in one respect, you can look at Taiwan as a case study of the people and a different government type to China and its government type, and look at the different responses of these two entities. And I'm going Team Taiwan every single time on most, if not all, issues that we come up against. Issues of human rights, issues of democracy, issues of the economy, issues of education, issues of collective responsibility, etc.
The Chinese government's more interested in signaling than reality. The reality is that there are biological bodies on an island who have solutions. You can use the signaling language all you like, whether they're a country or not, and this and that, and all that's just noise. It's no signal in that, right? And at the end of the day, they're an island and they govern themselves. And that island has contributed to the global economy, and they are a tiger economy that is here to stay. Right? Now you can talk about whether they have a Chinese flag or this and that, and this is just noise. This is like low quality people value stuff. At the end of the day, they're there. You know, so if a reservation Indian American community were to have value to add with a vaccination, can you imagine the U.S. covering it up because they're so insecure, they're worried about how that makes them look? I think that when you have a country that is that insecure about themselves, it's very dangerous. You know, look. You can tell the U.S. did this at Alamo or that, and I will just tell you, yeah, those people that are dead did those things. But it's like they have no self-confidence whatsoever. That if you say anything negative, the people, their leader, will flip out and panic. You know, like if they're that fragile, then they're not that sophisticated, and they're not these. You know, I used to say that historically Western racism romanticizes Asia as this like magical place with Zen Tzu, and that they've got these long-term strategies, and it's a bunch of crap. I mean, I knew a S&P company in China, and they had huge turnover of employees, like 20,000 every quarter, because people had very short-term thinking. It's not long-term. It's not 100 years. There's just some racist Western romanticization. There is nothing magical to find in that part of the world anywhere else. It's the same stuff. I mean, honestly, I think South Korea is a better economic miracle, better technology, a better governance, more transparent. If you want the U.S. out of Asia because you find it racist or imperialism, fine. Then put South Korea in charge. They know much better what they're doing than China could ever do. The CCP. I think that they're a better success story. Totally agree. Let them do it then. And they don't have the history of Japan and China with each other. But if you say that, then they'll get very upset and stuff like that. So they want to make their rise about some white Americans or others race. Okay, fine. Then put a Korean in charge. See how well it goes. And I would like to hear their point of view on that. And then they got another excuse. And then they got another excuse. And you get to the bottom line, end of the day. They want to dominate everything. And there's two is they. There's the government. Then there are delusional people who identify who they are by how they look. In the U.S., there's racism, but there's a long process to get over it. Right? And there is a huge effort, an open public battle to get rid of it. Even if we have leaders that signal it and stuff on a 100-year view, we're in the right direction. They're making no efforts like that whatsoever. So how many ethnic minorities are in the CCP? Representative proportional to the population. Do they make effort? Do they have policies imposing it? I doubt they do. So here you have a very ethnic nationalist-oriented CCP. And a lot of people who are in the diaspora, they visually identify looking like them, and they have some pride because they visually imagine it, despite having different cultures and different values. When you identify with people you don't have the same culture and values with, and then maybe it's how you look, that is, in my view, racism, right? And there is that part to it too. There's some pride around looking different, that there's an identity. And there are racist people in the West, and they don't help either. But as a global community, we have to try to move to something better. I don't see them contributing to that at all. I'd rather see them indulging in it.
you know, one of the reasons that race is a big issue in America is because it is a melting pot in a certain way. There are definitely different ethnic groups and racial groups and sometimes language groups too, but there's different groups that live all over the United States, and they live and they intermingle with each other. And inevitably, when you have different people who look different a little bit, you know, you have Asian Americans and Black Americans, African Americans and white Americans and Native Americans and Hispanic Americans. I mean, when all of these groups are intermingling and sharing under one culture, kind of like cultures of old, like Persia, right? Persia was a great empire, or the Roman Empire was a great empire, and the United States represents a sort of replica of these ideas. But, you know, they fall under this idea of the United States, and they try and make it work. And of course, when you have different people with different vying group effects. Of course, this argument about race is going to come up every now and again. But like you said, it's something that they're actively trying to manage, and they try to bring it into perspective with the overall national trajectory. So of course, you're going to have ideas of racism pop up in the CCP, like you say. It's all about Han. It's all about Han supremacy. Talk to the Tibetans. Talk to the Koreans. Talk to the Vietnamese. Talk to the Japanese. Talk to the Uyghurs. Talk to the Russians. I mean, talk to anybody who's in and around them who's not Han Chinese, and all of a sudden you get a very different perspective on this issue than you do in the United States, because there is not an active policy to try and mitigate racism, to mitigate Han supremacy. It's actually a state-sponsored and encouraged. It's an encouraged ethnic, language, and cultural group. It's a privileged cultural group in a way over the others. The Uyghurs and the Tibetans. I mean, nobody, like we say, nobody talks about the Tibetans anymore because they're finished. And and that's the Tibetans used to be a big. It used to be a big talking point, 10, 20 years ago. Now it's disappeared, and the Dalai Lama has to live in exile perpetually because of CCP policy. It's scary to think about that, and it's scary to think about how they convince the West to just go along with it, to just say, oh, we've all forgotten about Tibet now. We'll complain about the Uyghurs while they exist.
Yeah. It's a lot of things at once. So I think it's a political system that lacks humility, and that is the opposite of South Korea. So their leaders have humility and shame, and I think I don't see any there, and I'll get at that. They have argument that they raised a billion people out of poverty. Well, they put them there in the first place, though they had to fix the problem they created with communism. And they can argue about history, whatever. Well, that's just too bad. Like I said, the drunken driver, the one that kills someone, is the one who's responsible. And on your watch, you're responsible. It doesn't matter about the whataboutisms, doesn't matter about the hypotheticals. It's all irrelevant, it's all noise. There is just a signal that they put their people in poverty by the choices they made. And then they had to ask help to get them out. And they got help from Kissinger and Nixon and joining a trade pact with the US as a part of the Sino-Soviet split. And then they started to put manufacturing, and the US bet that they would become a democracy. And they put their bet on a theory and not on empiricism. And so I believe that the argument you see from some businesses that we're just going to invest and then they will get wealthy and then they will become a democracy. And that's BS. Total BS. There is no empiricism for that. Show me the statistical evidence of that anywhere. Even in structural realism with Mearsheimer, he makes a pretty compelling case with some data and very sophisticated models, right? So unipolar is somewhat uncertain, bipolar is more certain, multipolar is most uncertain. And these have sound reasoning to them. But saying that people get rich and they demand rights is a bit of a nonsense. So where is the time order, the causal logic for that exactly? So you're saying that they will want to not just be on Instagrams all day and they want to be politically represented? even though they have all the things they want, or they have VR sets on all the time in 10 years and they live to 80 or 90 or 120 and their lives are comfortable, that they're going to care about politics? I'm not so sure about that, right? And for the rest of us, though, because we're maybe culturally conditioned, this is not an acceptable outcome. I would rather live to 50 than live to 200 if it's under someone else's unitary rule. You can take that and shove it up your behind. So I will always challenge the leaders. I will always, if I'm an audience, challenge the authority of the minister, because every person is the same from womb to tomb, equal. And that the only value of a person is the coherent logic of the words that come out of their mouth. Their social hierarchy, their status, their title. This is all no signal, high noise, low value culture, whether it's in Silicon Valley, China, or anywhere. And those are my values. And so we'll say, well, Trump is like this, or Bush is like that, or Obama is like that. I don't know about those people. From my perspective, America's inside me, and all I need is that in myself. I don't care what other people are doing. And it's personalities like mine that the CCP will face. And they're never going to be a ruler of anything in the world. It's never going to happen.
You know, yeah, you mentioned some interesting points there, and you know, Xi Jinping has become like an emperor of old. He's assumed more power unto his person, and I like that you premised this whole discussion with the topic of power, and you mentioned Mearsheimer, which is about realism. Realism essentially boils down to power, and you know, and this idea of feeding the beast, essentially. But you know, Xi Jinping has assumed more power unto himself than almost any emperor of old. This is kind of the trajectory of China, more and more power to the head in order to keep this stable. And yes, all those other notions of freedom of choice, individualism, free markets, everything keeps going out the window. And we see this with the disappearances of billionaires, millionaires, anybody. It doesn't matter. Party officials, anybody who speaks out against Xi Jinping or his very close cadre of officials. This is well known. This is well documented, and it shows. I think it shows two things. It shows the tyrannical nature of China, and the fact that Kissinger was wrong, and the fact that Nixon and the, you know, these they were wrong on this bet that an empowered China would generate a middle class that would demand a democracy. All it did was empower a middle class that then handed over more power and authority to a leader, and you know, and gave them the resources and the tools in order to maintain that structure. You know, with the CCP, they were the ones who implemented the social credit system, which they've been using in this coronavirus effectively. You know, to lock people out of accounts, to manage how they where they can go, what they can do, goods buy, you know, what goods and services they can buy. It's very authoritarian. It's very disturbing. It's not in line with anything that, you know, we would consider United Nations worthy. And I guess that's the other thing is, you know, this creates a super dynamic that scares international organizations that the rest of the world adhere to, like the United Nations or like the WHO, into conforming to their rules and conforming to what they think is right. You've seen this with the WHO especially, where they've bowed down to China and said, you're doing a great job, but really they know they're not doing a great job, and they let this coronavirus spread across the world and harm the world.
There are two things going on. So there's the CCP, and we very much know what they're about. So I want to just dissect three things. So there's the CCP, and then there is the gap between our model in our minds and then their behavior, and we're not correcting the model for a lot of us. So they're Machiavellian. So if you told them that this is wrong and it's not right, the people in their leadership will smile and say, okay, and they're going to keep doing what they want. It's irrelevant to them, that ethics of it being right or wrong. They're just learning how to signaling, like saying the thing that moves you, right? They're not interested in your ethics, whatever. They want to know what they want to get, and they want wealth. They want the world to worship their versions of Paris and the Louvre. They want those in China. They want their own things, and everything else you argue is just noise to them. And they will tell it to you what you want to hear with signaling. And you see it all the time. Alternative economic models, another word for taking taxpayer money, pooling it, and then engaging in joint ventures with South Korean and Japanese companies for construction, getting the blueprints on how to build these cities, and then deploying. And if people get in the way, they murder them. So one high net worth individual in China disappears, is murdered, or commits suicide every 40 days. And that has been for at least we know 8 years straight, and probably maybe the 20 total, okay? So that's the signal, and everything else is the noise. It's not an alternative economic model. It's the same thing other people have been doing, just at a larger scale, and enabled by the WTO and foreign technology transfer joint venture. China's success is the world's success. It's not theirs. If the rest of the world wasn't technically advanced, China would have never risen because they would have never had known how to do it. Didn't have something to model after, right? Same thing for U.S.'s success or anyone else. So, in World War II, the Spitfire didn't work well until they put a British engine in it. Global innovation is a global effort. It's not a national thing necessarily always. I think it's important to be a bit humble about that. Sometimes, like sports teams, people beat their chest and it's a little bit fun. But then we got to put our big boy pants on and realize that, the world's a little more complicated than that. The other thing I want to point out is there is another third issue. So there's the CCP and signaling and noise, and then the second is that they're very Machiavellian, and we have to get to that truth. And then the third is the problem also in the US and Europe and other places. And that problem is companies have to have a higher purpose, a higher moral standard than the law. You cannot say the law says. Nazi said the law says. That doesn't cut it. Okay? So Google, for example, its policy towards China is one of a higher standard. They don't care what the Chinese law says. They have their principles. Apple is different. Apple is a lot more like how the Nazis were. Their view is what the law says they will follow. You can't do that, in my opinion. You have to have a higher standard than the law. If U.S. law told me I had to do something and it was below my higher standard, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't comply with the law. And people have to have that. You can't have a fish as a CEO that says the law says. Auschwitz prison guard said the law says. That's a pathetic answer. The law is an excuse of no behavior. You're still wrong even if the law said you could do it. And that's what I would say to Tim Cook. Doesn't matter. And then the second thing about the West is people think that there's something they can get from China. And when human beings think they can get something, they rationalize good. They don't want to hear the bad because they're under this illusion that they can get something. And that illusion has to be ripped down.
Wow, yeah. And this idea of the law says, it plays out a lot. I mean, do you think that, for example, ignorance is allowed to play into a factor of this idea of the law says? For example, lending to the law said that, and I'm using an example here, but the law said that Wells Fargo or Bank of America could make loans to low-income people with no who are on welfare and who have no job and no money down. These NERP, ZERP, HERP loans. The law said that was okay, and it was encouraged by George Bush and others. Should have these banks, for example, stood up and said, actually, you know what, that could tank the economy, could tank us, it could put the American economy in a bad way. We're not going to do it. We're going to take the moral high ground and not lend to minority communities in an egregious way. I mean, why? How does that play in?
Well, in every society, you have a lower type of person that does the minimum of everything, and they think that they're not responsible for their own standards, and they use the system as the excuse. They're just doing what they said. I mean, I always meet these kind of people everywhere in the world, and you just know that this person is, is a tool. It's not like a fully self-actualized individual, and they're there everywhere, you know. And then they have these behaviors, and they want to be treated with dignity. And I'm sorry, guy, but dignity is a privilege, and it's not my fault if your parents weren't around to raise you like that. That's your. No, I'm not paying the price for that.
And you know, that is unfortunately, in that circumstance that I raised, those companies went through, the CEOs signed off on that and said, we're actually going to follow, we're going to do it because the law says. And, you know, it's kind of this position where you get the most corrupt in charge. So by that definition, you know, Xi Jinping in China there must be the most corrupt, because that's how you rise up through the swamp of an authoritarian system. You know, where you can dictate law and say, well, the law says, right? This is how the CCP works. You have to be the most corrupt if you have no moral dignity or no self-awareness or self-consciousness at the center of who you are.
There are 100 billionaires in China's parliament. Of course, it's one of the most corrupt governments in the world. So that should tell you that in itself, right? Yeah,
it's the rule of the ultra elite. It's sad. It's sad because you know, coming from the communist roots, obviously, communism is supposed to be about the great equalizer in humanity. I think Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels or any of these Lenin or any of these full-on communist advocates would have talked about, at least at the bare minimum, communism being a great equalizer for human beings, where you don't have a bourgeoisie dominating a proletariat class. It's about everyone being equal. When Lenin stood up on the stage in Russia, he would dress down. He would not have a suit and tie on. He would dress down to look a part of the people. I know that's not the way communism works. Not here advocating communism, but I'm saying that the theory is not about having 100 billionaires at the top dominating a underclass. It's about everyone sort of having equal access to resources, so that that society meets your needs rather than your greed. But somehow that's been flipped on its head, and it always is flipped on its head, which is why I would never advocate communism at all. I know all the flaws, but the theory is dead and broken in the water, is it not?
Look, Marx probably also liked the smell of his own farts. So sometimes we get down these bizarre tunnels, and we need to bring it back to first principles. So if you have excessive power in a two-person prisoner's dilemma game, you just lose. So you go metaphysical in the game. So you're trying to say that communism is a way to go metaphysical in the game and neutralize the counterparty that has asymmetric power in a two-person game, right? Or two-party or two-force game. But you don't have to have communism to do that, right? You can have crowdsourcing. You can have revolution. You can have unions. You can have restructuring things because of the COVID-19. You can have zealous despotic leaders. You can have reforming your political system. You can have a resource-abundant world abound from innovation where wealth becomes irrelevant because breakthroughs in quantum computers permit us to have things like semiconductors at room temperature, which redoes manufacturing, or an AI moves us closer to automation. And what he was really getting at is that, and I think that it's not his fault, it was they didn't have this kind of imagination at that time, and they maybe perhaps had not such a hardened understanding of game theory, and some of them did, but it was very much also, you have to also understand at that time they believed in like ghosts, and they believed in, I mean, they were smart people, but you have to put it in context that they were getting a lot of noise from the world around them too, right? So when people cling to these single answer, and they're very culturally infused explanations, I always smell bullshit. So it's just game theory. and you either have an asymmetric power or equal, and you can find other ways to go metaphysically to counter it and check the power. So there are two ways to run a country. So I look at it, I'll talk systematic finance, okay, or investment management. So I will use some esoteric terminology, but my audience will get it. And those of you who don't understand, please go Google it, okay? So a single power running a country like North Korea or Singapore or a very concentrated power, or China, or Putin. These are long-only strategies, so they have no hedge. And some of them do really well and get lots of beta, like China or South Korea in an early stage, right? Then you can also have a complete wipeout and lose it. South Korea had that in '97, right? Long-only strategies have no hedge. So a long-only strategy is like one government and no competition. And they can do a really good run until there's a big drawdown and they lose everything. A democratic system that is well designed and architected is like a market neutral strategy. You're hedged. But market neutral strategies don't get the performance of long only with no hedge, right? They look like they're not doing as well. Maybe they get 3% growth annualized. Maybe they have a real hard time getting reform and changes in the healthcare system, but they move slower and they move more steady, right? And so they last for hundreds of years. The long only strategies last much shorter time. Singapore will have its day like Hong Kong. So will other ones like that, because they're long only strategies with no hedge. So they have a big blind side coming, and when one day the big drawdown comes, they lose it all. And China will have the same thing. They'll lose it all until they do like South Korea and reform. It's not about whether it's democracy or it's about having a hedge. The other thing about power is that there are two ways to manage the passions of the people. So that's the real thing. So it's not just the CCP, it's the passion of the people. The CCP is afraid of their own people in some ways. So there are great Chinese people that want to be a part of the world, and then there are very ferocious nationalistic type full of pride. And the CCP probably fears them a little bit. Okay? So the way you manage these wackos that exist in the US and elsewhere is to pit them against each other in a faction design system, which comes from Federalist Paper 9. So the founding fathers were very good at metaphysics. And they understand how humans work because they saw more war than any of us today. And they read about it and they were closer to it than the dead children and the things they experienced. Game theory is the same no matter what generation and time you live, right? So, of course, you can infuse, like I said, other cultural things, but the founding fathers were high decouplers, very high decouplers, right? In their thinking, super abstract and brilliant. And in this faction-like system that people battle each other and they don't make lots of progress, the moment the Democrats win every election, it's no longer democracy. The moment the progressives get their way and they get everything they want, it's not a democracy anymore. Because for that to happen, they would have had no resistance and they had asymmetry, right? You'd never want that to happen. I'm sorry to break the bad news to them or the social conservative, anyone. America is not a democracy anymore when someone wins every election. That's the worst thing that can happen, is for them to actually succeed at everything. In China's case, they have just one system. Right, so they manage power by concentrating and telling you what to say. And here's the problem with that. They already are expanding speech censorship beyond their borders with the NBA and others. And that is to maintain the facade of power. They have to expand things. As China grows in power, so will their beyond their borders control of speech. They already started with the NBA, right? I mean, I had an interesting Chinese nationalist tell me you're a freedom fanatic, because I said I'd rather die than being told I can't say something. But thank God America's culture is like that, right? Because then the people in CCP will always fear us, and they will know that if they bring that bullshit here, they'll come to the Second Amendment. And one thing I know about the Chinese military forces is that they have no experience. They're noobs, as they say in gaming.
Yeah, no, you're right. They are, and the American forces, for better or worse, are far more experienced, have far more global power projection, and have been involved in many, many wars. And yes, and you basically have a standing army there in the United States because of the Founding Fathers and the Second Amendment rights. Lots and lots of guns, and lots of people know how to use guns. It's an interesting dynamic. Hey, I wanted to ask you, by the way, before we wrap things up in a moment, do you think that civilization itself is put on what do you think the future of civilization is with this COVID-19? Do you think that we can recover, that civilization can recover from COVID-19 with rising unemployment and financial problems, blah, blah, blah? Do you think it's okay? Do you think we'll be all right? Or do you think that there is something bigger going on, a big shift in civilization right now?
Yeah, there obviously are. I think some spirits for very tragic. So I live in near Seattle, and where I live, we were one of the first places in the U.S. hit. So we were under quarantine, and we had a number of meaningful deaths, but nothing like New York City. And it's tragic, and I have a lot of friends in New York City. There is the economic aspect. I think 20% of the police in New York City were homesick. So we have issues and problems, and it's the CCP's fault. So I don't care here about how U.S. responded or Europe, France, Italy, doesn't matter. The one who was like in a drunk driver canary, the one that actually did it was them. So too bad about hypotheticals. And you hang the one that did it, not the one that could have. So in that context, we're here because of that. And going for some things, silver linings. So a lot of people are in a state of psychosis, that we're so far high up the Maslow hierarchy of needs, we spend a lot of our mindsets around arbitrary things that are not that important, right? And now we're learning that we have to deal with things that are important. Will I die or not? I think humans should never escape a stage where we have to face mortality regularly, because it keeps us grounded. It keeps us not losing priorities in how we treat our family members and our friends. It's a good silver lining, right? People are learning that having friends in your life is important, right? That nothing is a given. The other things that will come from this, I believe, though, is that we are all traumatized globally. So even after we have vaccinations and herd immunity, we will not be the same. Whenever people sneeze, we will be nervous. We will go out with ourselves a sense of trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder globally about this event. It's different from other ones. And that is a fact. And I don't know what that looks like for us. And then there is the supply chain part, right? So it's very clear that the Chinese government, I read the Australians donated billions of masks during the wildfires. But they're using this opportunity to play politics. The Australians didn't really play that up. They didn't do a rodeo round of bragging about it. The Chinese are. And that's all right. You want to play that game. They can choose to do that, but it's going to be a price for it. And, so there is that aspect. I think the economy I think people haven't realized that's still unwinding. And, I don't really know what that looks like. I just really hope that the engine gets back on soon so that there is no civil unrest and things like that. But it's also a chance for people to come together. It's no secret that Americans are very individualistic people, but it's also an opportunity to maybe make some things anew with community. And that is great because we have to resist the rise of censorship from China and the things that they don't have to offer the rest of the world.
That's actually quite optimistic, because there's a lot of pessimism out there. There's a lot of theories floating around that this is the end of the world and all that. I don't see that. History is too long run for that. We've seen a lot worse as human beings, and it's more of a thump. It's more of a friendly thump in the chest as opposed to a knife, slitting the throat. I don't think we're at that point yet. The unemployment isn't unmanageable, even if it is 6 million, even if it is 20 million. That's not unmanageable for a population of 350 million that has the world's, the richest country that ever existed. It's not unmanageable. And as the wars wind down in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, in everywhere else, that money is coming home. Those nation builder projects are coming home. So why not redeploy that into a domestic, it's about America. That's the idea. Because if America can survive this, the world can survive this.
Look, I'm here, and I see all these different communities, and people are learning to become responsible really fast and escaping this state of psychosis. It's like the tough guy that can beat anybody up until they learn they can't. And so people are coming to reality very quickly here because they're very agile. And that's the history of our country. We're very agile and adaptive people. The U.S. had at Pearl Harbor almost no meaningful Navy. Their armed forces were not very prepared. And within a year, just totally pounded them. So that's how people are here. And that's one of the enduring things. And it's not to the Chinese CCP, I'd say it's not a white or anything thing. It's a cultural thing. It's got nothing to do with race, people, and history. You know, my friends are here they're Americans, they're from Korea, immigrated Americans. They drive muscle cars. They're people of Indian parents and they are Americans. And they don't like the CCP and they want nothing to do with it. And my Chinese American friends don't. If the Chinese government knew I was working with Chinese American friends, they might harass them because they think in a racist way, right? They're stuck in the 1930s. They haven't moved forward. There is no place for them in this world.
Yeah, you're right. And you know, there's do you think that the CCP should pay reparations or pay some sort of fine to the world, or donate money, or you know, because they are playing politics. You mentioned the Australian case. That's not you know, anything huge, but they are playing politics. They're playing politics in the WHO. They're playing politics in the UN Security Council. They're leveraging their own mistake, their own problem against the world, and saying essentially, you know, some reports have come out saying that China should pay $6 trillion. You know, Australia had to take on $130 billion worth of debt in order to survive this crisis. It could send our economy into a tailspin depending on how long we go. We're not a very large population. We're not you know, comparatively that wealthy compared to, you know, two superpowers like the United States and China that could last this thing out.
I think it's a bit of a distraction to talk about that. I think there is a bigger thing to get. And that is a new government in China.
New government. So you think they should change the government? I mean, that's a very. I mean, that's the thing. Xi Jinping, as I said, has assumed more power unto himself than any premier or emperor of old. He is now essentially responsible for everything the good that goes right in China, and also everything that goes bad. And you know,
they don't like U.S. President Trump, and that's fine. So it's either next November or 4 years later you'll get a new one. And we're going to ask the same of you. Let's be equal about this. We don't like yours, so give us a new one. 50-50, equal partners.
Yeah, interesting. New government in China. Well, you know, the Chinese people might agree with you at some point. I'm not sure. It's about their control over the people and how they manage that control. And you know, with manufacturing running away from China, Japan moving their manufacturing out. The United States will be moving their manufacturing out at a rapid pace when this unfreezes. They will be going to Mexico. They will be going to South America. They will not stay in Asia. There are a lot of countries that will not manufacture there now. I think that will lead to a temporary rise. You will hear a temporary rise of China and all this sort of stuff. And then I think the social unrest will begin after that, and China will have to start to consider its place in the world and its own government system as it tries to manage the fallout of what you know much better than I do, of all its financial problems, which are massive, especially in the banking system and much bigger in the shadow banking system. There's a lot of misallocated money and capital there that's going to have to unwind. It's huge. So yeah, I think I wouldn't say that a government replacement is not on the table, but in the short run, you're going to hear a lot of pro-China stuff coming out of every country, and that is the time to really think about who's on whose team in a certain respect.
Well, weaker people will always think about all the money they can get and put that before their principles. So they don't have a higher calling, right? And these kind of categories of people in history have always faced extreme backlash or, you know, guillotines. And so if you were in France and you were selling out the French because you wanted to be a survivor, you were going to end up guillotined. And it happened over and over and over. So, I understand that some people are not like that, and but look, for me, as a fairly educated American that's world traveled and has done a lot of things, and perhaps I'm a perfectly able body and I can produce and create jobs, I have to never think about myself. I have to think about, because we're geographically pinned people, so I have to think about the weakest link. I have to think about my family members who cannot do these things. Not everyone can be a computer programmer and things. So I have a caretaker responsibility and also an investor obligation. But if I'm thinking about flying off to Mars and leaving them, or going to be a part of that new system in China and abandoning them, then I think you're a coward and you're a weak and pathetic person. And you should apologize to your parents for not guiding you correctly, or ask them to apologize to you.
What really interesting, and I like the French analogy as well. The revolution was a huge turning point in history in France. With those values being instigated, but the royalists did come back. Napoleon, helped to bring the revolution to a fruition, and then the royalists did come back, and that there was a gap between when Napoleon was gone and when he come back, and that really shone a light on who was who, and I think that's a very interesting analogy.
I think there's the two things I'll mention that so I really am bullish on the French system in Europe to be very successful.
Yeah,
and that is because in times of rough seas, having a clear compass that is of a higher purpose than the rule of law will steer your ship correctly. And French have a very, very solid system, and they know who they are. And they're also humble people who joke about all the things that are wrong with them, which is a great characteristic because it keeps people grounded. So it doesn't matter what government they have, doesn't matter who is president, the French are the French. And the same can be said for South Korea. So they don't care who the president is. They don't care what the law is, bringing a dog or not a dog onto the public bus. They're going to do what they want anyway because they have a higher purpose than these Mickey Mouse changes and laws, right? And Silicon Valley needs to get back to that same thing. The Zoom event is a travesty. It's disgusting.
Yes.
You can't just chase money. You need to have a higher purpose. Doesn't matter what the law says. And these kind of civilizations don't survive. They eventually bite their own tail. If you're just chasing everything, you're going to end up with nothing. So I think that out of the coronavirus, there's will be some changes here, I believe, soon.
All right. But yeah, that's I'm bullish on France. As you know, I sat in front of the Eiffel Tower for a long time there. I absolutely agree with you. I think they have a solid base to work from. They have valuable values. And they've won more wars than they've ever lost. I mean, their whole their coward thing, I never understood that. They're exceptional fighters, and regardless of what you think about that, that's something that's very true, which means they have spirit. And Koreans are in that category as well. Japanese as well. Very, very resilient population. But yes, no, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I agree, I think the lesson that you've dished out there about don't always put money first, put morals and values first. It does pay off, even in the business world. It pays off. Unfortunately, we do live in an era of bailouts where a bad behavior is rewarded. But I think Americans will not put up with this system for much longer. I think there is a reckoning going to happen. It might not happen under the Trump administration, but I think Americans want a different system where people such as yourself or what you're talking about put their morals before the law. These companies in the future will be rewarded over gross selfish mismanagement within the law. I think people will not put up with it forever, and I think the companies that embrace that strategy, not a strategy, but it's our strategy for now because of the law, but that actual just that moral idea will come out on top in the long run. And history, there is historical evidence to prove that is the case. it's something that, that does win out in the end. And I think America is bumping up and down on the end of the reward for bad behavior, especially in business, reward for bad behavior model. I think it's coming to an end. And if you're out there and you want to copy that model because you've seen corrupt people do it and you want to get a piece of the pie, I wouldn't start now, because it doesn't feel like the American population will put up with it for much longer. I think we're bumping up and down on the end of that.
I think I don't know if you're we're going to end, but I'll add a couple of things if you don't mind.
Sure.
So you asked what happened to come out of the coronavirus. Well, remote work is certainly putting a little bit of pressure to double check whether we have secure connections, because now it's also essential people. So remote work, I think, will be a part of the future. As you know, I'm going to sell my company. So we are using National Institute of Standard Technology defined post-quantum. So it's not a buzzword for us. There's actually a definition by the US government, and we follow their guidance. And following their guidance, we fall into a category of offering a VPN that is unable to be cracked, the encryption with a Chinese or other quantum computer. So they can't harvest the data and crack it. Now up to 1,000 qubit they can. So we can say our cryptography has a shelf life, but all cryptography has a shelf life. So, SSL can be broken and things like that. So things eventually stop working. But as it is right now, those are what we're working on. And being, as you can see, for me personally and my colleagues, Andrew McElroy, Scott Brower, and the rest of them, we are selfless people. So sometimes people ask, who do you think you are? I'm nothing, I'm no one. I am not important at all. It's just what we're doing that is important, and delivering it to people. And I would ask everyone to think like that. It's not time to be thinking about who is who and who is Elon Musk. And, we don't need more leaders. We need more delivery. And I think that's it. So to the CCP people, they say, who are you? I'll say no one. That's the most dangerous part. I'm nothing. Yeah. And if nothing can challenge your ideas, then you have a very fragile system.
Very, 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 very interesting. Well, thank you very much, Kevin, for coming on. Always wise words, and it's really good to get your perspective on things and helping us through this. A lot to learn, a lot to take away from that talk, and all the best with you. Stay safe out there. You're in a sort of an epicenter. I don't know. The whole globe seems to be an epicenter right now, but you stay safe. All right. Thank you so much for coming on Detonation.
AmbitVPN.com, please. AmbitVPN.com. Thanks so much. Bye bye.
Yep. AmbitVPN.com. And thanks to everyone who's helps us at Detonation. That's Kevin Flynn. I'm Steel Archer. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.